Alright, time to review how to install compression fittings on the tube. Our compression fittings are made of two parts. On one hand, the barb, on the other, the compressor ring. So let's go ahead and assemble our tube to the barb. Try to get the tube to go around the barb from an angle. If this is your first time, don't be surprised, you will need to apply some force onto this. Putting some hot water on the extremity of your tubes usually helps a little bit to make it more flexible. To make sure that this is really watertight, I would want the tube to go all the way to the base of the barb. And let's repeat this operation on the other extremity of your tube. But before doing so, let's take a look at our compression ring. One of its sides is bended and the other has screw rings. Make sure not to screw it too tight. Finger tight will be plenty of pressure to retain the tube to the barb. Yeah, don't repeat one of my common mistakes. Make sure to put in place the other extremity compression ring before placing its barb. There is really nothing fun about trying to pull out a barb out of a tube because you forgot to put the compression ring right before. Okay, time to review our loop. In this particular machine, we are going to have 7 tubes and a total of 14 in and outlets. Clockwise and starting from our reservoir, our loop will go through the pump, the 480mm radiator, our video card, our 240mm radiator, back through the motherboard, our CPU block, and finally back to the reservoir. And now let's take a look at the tubing. Clockwise and following the same order, we are going to connect 14 in and out connectors. And once everything is tightly put together, water should be able to flow in the very same clockwise order through all the connections and tubes that we have installed back to the reservoir. Finally, let's start tubing. I usually start by connecting the reservoir to the water pump. But really, you can install the tubing in any order you wish. Just make sure to take your time and don't rush anything. Again, when you're tightening things together, finger tight is quite enough. As I mentioned in the previous parts of this video, the compression fittings that we did put in place were merely an indication of how many we would need and making sure that both their sizes and fittings would be a perfect match to our loop. As you assemble your loop, you will see that sometimes you need to add an elbow of 45 degrees, like in this example, a 90 degrees or whatever extensions to make sure that the loop makes sense, and that your tubing does not have unnecessary bending. It will allow a better flow and a more efficient cooling as well. Alright, this is where it gets a little tricky. We are going to connect our 240mm radiator outlet to the motherboard inlet. Once done, we are going to connect our motherboard outlet to our CPU water block inlet. In my opinion, this is by far the most difficult part of our build, so let's take our time and review every step in detail. First, let's build the tube bridge which will connect the 240mm radiator to our motherboard water block. This will be a very short tube, and the shorter tubes are, the more difficult they are to assemble together. On short bridges like this one, we really need to pay attention to the length of the tube. Basically, you just need to make sure that the tube is neither too long nor too short. But if you do get it wrong, like I often do, we can use extensions to correct any mismatch. In our case, I am using a 10mm extension. Back to the motherboard. As you can see, I have added a 90-degree elbow to our radiator outlet, as well as a 45-degree elbow to our motherboard inlet. Add to those the bridge we just have assembled, and we are done. Well, for now. Briefly, let's review the components used on this bridge. First, a 90 degrees elbow, a compression fitting, another compression fitting, a 10mm extension, and finally a 45 degrees flexible elbow. Of course, it really goes down to your personal taste. We could have gone on an easier path and build a bridge mainly made of connectors, but I still wanted to see the liquid flowing through our loop in this particular case. Now that's done, let's take a look at the second bridge. And yes, this one is even trickier, so let's take it slow. Okay, so what have we here? Tubes, compression fittings, 90-degree flexible elbows, small extensions, and a 40mm longer extension. First, let's cut our tube. Now, this tube is even shorter than the one we have assembled in the previous bridge. So take your time, go slow, make it happen. Please make sure to fit in all the pressure rings before putting the second barb. If you could see my fingers right now, you'd understand why I'm repeating this over and over again. Putting out solid barbs out of flexible tubes is a pain, an absolute pain. I'm not sure I'll ever get over this. Alright, I'll stop the rant. Let's move on to the other accessories for this bridge. First, a flexible 90 degrees elbow on one side of the bridge, a 10mm extension, another flexible 90 degree elbow, and finally our massive 40mm extension. Alright, so on the tube flexible side, this is your motherboard outlet. On the massive extension side, this is your CPU inlet. Thanks to its tubing and different flexible components, this bridge should have no problem to adjust the different angles and lengths between your motherboard water block and the CPU water block. And that's how pretty it should look if you've done everything right. So now let's continue our tubing from the 240mm inlet to our GPU outlet. Compared to what we've just done, this should be a piece of cake. And now from our 480mm outlet to our GPU inlet. And finally, the somewhat tricky last tube. We are going to connect our pump outlet to our 480mm radiator inlet. And finally we're done. That was the last tube for our loop. In our excitement, we shouldn't forget that one of these days we are going to drain the system. Of course, you can do it without a drain valve, but still, it is a good idea to add one at this stage. It will just make your life easier and save you a lot of cleaning. On the T-block that we have previously installed on the water pump inlet, we had previously installed a seal plug. Now we are going to remove it and instead install a male-to-male adapter. Make sure that all the components are screwed to finger tight and no more. Next we are going to screw in a 15mm extension adapter. It will allow us to easily install a 90-degree flexible elbow. And finally, our shutoff valve. A little piece of advice here. Whenever you open or close the shutoff valve, keep in mind that the handle is made of plastic, meaning that one day or another, plastic over metal, the plastic will break. So when opening or closing the valve, stay as gentle as you can.